Pacha was sent round the world to study postgraduate education in every land and returned charged with the advantages of the Johns Hopkins Institution at Baltimore. Sir William Ramsay was brought from Britain to lead the weight of his scientific knowledge and experience. A sum of 30 lakh rupees was set aside as foundation money. Long and wearisome was the path to achievement. It had not been trodden to the goal when Jamsetji Tata died. It was indeed then doubtful whether it would ever be brought to fruition, but his sons accepted the project. As a trust, they decided to continue the offer of the original sum of 30 lakhs. And aided by a large grant from the government of India and a generous gift of land and money from the Maharaj of Mysore, the foundation stone was laid in the Pleasant station of Bangalore in 1911, and students were admitted to classes in general and applied chemistry, electrotechnology, and organic chemistry. And students were that was the origin and history of the Indian Institute of Science, the foremost institution for the teaching of higher science in the East. Even the most casual survey of the industrial field carries the conviction that no country can become industrially great which does not possess an iron and steel industry. It is indispensable to the formation of a true economic cycle. India had practiced for ages a smelting industry, whose caliber can be gauged from the famous iron pillar at Delhi. But like the industry of Sussex, it languished as the forests were drawn upon for charcoal and before the competition of the highly organized industries of the West. A useful factory for the production of pig iron was founded at Kulti in Bengal, but the attempt to produce steel was a failure, and the needs of the country were supplied from abroad. In the year 1899, one of those far-sighted artillery officers to whom India owes so much, Major R. H. Mahon, superintendent of the government ordnance factories at Kosipur, produced a prophetic report. He declared that the time had come for the establishment of iron and steel works on a considerable scale, that these should be on the most modern lines, and that the most favorable theatre for operations was Bengal. Jamsetji Tata seized on the idea with avidity, remitted the direction of the enterprise largely to his eldest son Dorabji, and provided the funds for the prospecting activity from his own purse. Later, he established contact with two men who were destined to play a large part in the enterprise: Julian Kennedy of the firm of Julian Kennedy, Salin and Co., and Charles Page Penn, a mining engineer of worldwide experience. Romance has been used to describe the rise of Bombay. It is equally applicable to the establishment of the iron and steel industry. Jamsetji Tata was not alone in the field of research. The prospector was abroad in the land, and more than one financier fixed his gaze on the Indian scene. Whilst waiting for an interview with the head of the central provinces, Dorabji drifted by chance into the museum and there noticed on the geological map a large area in the drug district colored to represent deposits of iron. Secretly, he and his geological expert went to the scene and discovered a veritable hill of iron ore of the richest quality. That was enough. Good cooking coal was found in the Jeheria district. Limestone and manganese were available in abundance, and the major problem was solved. Here was the iron and the coal. It only remained to fix the site of economic assembly and manufacture, and to find the money. The latter was the greater difficulty of the two. British capital played a great part in the development of India, but it was for the most part been on conservative lines. There was always money ready for established credit. There was little or none for the creation of new credits. The present generation little appreciates the difficulties under which the early industrialists labored. They had first to risk their all, then to go cap in hand to their friends for financial support. Assuming this succeeded, then as soon as an asset was created, it had to be pledged for working capital. No one dreamt that the unprecedented sum needed for an iron and steel industry could be found in the country itself. The scheme, ripe for exploitation after Jamsetji Tata's death, was literally hawked around London and New York without success. All the heavy preliminary expenses were met from the Tata house. In an hour of inspiration, Dorabji Tata decided to appeal to his own countrymen. A new spirit was abroad. The Swadeshi movement, the movement for the development of India's immense resources, was at its heights. The response was immediate. The public subscribed the whole of the capital required, 1,630,000 pounds, and when a further sum of 400,000 pounds was needed, a single Indian prince, the Maharaj of Gwalior, provided the money. That was the origin of the Steel City, which grew in the jungles of Chota Nagpur. The engineers literally went into the wilderness, a land of scrub jungle, thinly peopled with descendants of the original inhabitants of India, the Santhals. The land had to be cleared and leveled, the river dammed for water, a railway connection established with the main line, and another to the Hill of Iron at Guru Maishini, where an almost inexhaustible supply of the finest ore was available. From these beginnings have grown the iron and steel works of today. It was a graceful act of the Government of India to change the name of Sakchi to Jamshedpur and of the railway junction to Tatanagar. Turn now to another enterprise with which the name of Jamsetji Tata is indissolubly associated. Bombay was the original center of the cotton textile industry. From the crest of Malabar Hill, the curious could look forth and see the smoke rising from 80 chimneys, spreading over the island a mephitic fog, which hung like the pall of a London particular on a stilly morning, ideally situated in many respects, with a magnificent harbour and every facility for exporting to the once profitable markets of China, Japan, and the Levant. It labors under one disadvantage: remoteness from the coal fields. In the early days, fuel came from South Wales and Yorkshire. Then Natal entered the field. But with the development of the Indian mines, indigenous supplies captured the market. That involved rail carriage of 1200 miles from Bengal, or the rail come sea route with considerable loss from repeated handling. Yet in the Western Ghats, Immense resources in hydroelectric power lay dormant. A region of constant rainfall, in places up to 300 inches, an immediate fall of 1800 feet, and an established demand 60 miles away. What could the financier and engineer ask more? The successful working of a modest scheme of Shivasmundram in Mysore, where the waters of the Kavari River were harnessed to furnish hydroelectricity to drive the Kolar gold mines, had revealed the prospects of water power. And when this scheme was brought to the attention of Jamsetji Tata by David Gosling, a practicing architect of imagination, it at once appealed to his fertile mind. As with everything else in the India of those days, the wheels of government moved slowly, and government aid was essential to the granting of the necessary licenses and the acquisition of the land. Little had been done save the preliminary work when Tata crossed over. The burden of carrying his ideas to completion again rested on the shoulders of Dorabji. Here again, finance seemed to be the rock on which the enterprise might founded. Arrangements were almost complete for the enlistment of London finance when the governor of the day, Lord Sandham, himself an engineer of repute, urged Indian capitalists to make the work their own. Again, the response was amazing. When the Tata Hydroelectric Company was launched in 1910, the capital of 2 crores of rupees was promptly subscribed. The Tata hydroelectric scheme is complicated. There is a shallow lake at Lonavala to store the monsoon rains, then a supplementary reservoir at Walwan, connected with it by duct, and at a later stage comes the immense lake at Shirvata, whose waters are carried into Walwan by tunnel, the magnitude of which may be indicated by the fact that the containing dam is as large as the famous Assuan barrage on the Nile. Before the scheme was completed, a demand arose for yet more power, and site was found in the Andhra Valley, where the waters were stored in a single lake and carried to the turbines at the foot of the hills through a tunnel. This paved the way for the yet bigger scheme, damming the Nirmula River on the same lines as Andhra and supplying the turbines through a tunnel. This connected work developed no less than 244,000 electric horsepower, the whole of which was absorbed in the industries of Bombay. The electrification of the suburban and part of the main railway lines and in Pune and the island of Salsati. The total share capital of the associate companies was rupees 9 million. Through this agency, it could have been claimed that Bombay was the most electrified city in the world. For the Bombay Electrical Supply and Tramway Company, acting as distributors, carried electricity into the smallest dwellings, even to thousands of consumers each with no more than a single light. Applying these activities to the canons of greatness suggested earlier, who can deny that Jamsetji Tata was entitled to the title of a great Indian? He brought into industry a new concept. He was no imitator, but carved out a fresh field, going to the sources of supply of the raw material, cotton, and to the market. More, in an age of cheapness, he sought the most efficient material money could buy. For him, the best was only just good enough. He was a pioneer in the work of industrial welfare and had a vivid interest in the lives of his employees. Again, he had an abiding sense of responsibility to his shareholders. When he entered the textile industry, the vicious system obtained of the managing agents drawing a commission of a quarter of an anna on every pound of yarn spun. It sometimes paid the agent to work full time, even when the yarn had to be sold at a loss. Tata substituted the commission of 10% on profits now general. No profits, no commission. Then, when his fortunes were established, he looked abroad to see how best they could be utilized for the advantage of his country. It was said of a great writer that he took the whole world of learning for his province. Of Tata, it might equally be said that the whole field of industry came within his ambit. Those associated activities, the Indian Institute of Science to train the higher personnel, the iron and steel works to start the true economic cycle, and the hydroelectric stations to furnish cheap power and conserve the coal resources left an enduring mark on his own generation. He did not live to see the coping stone placed on his work, but so well were the foundations laid, so determined, the enthusiasm inspired in his sons and colleagues, that they pressed it to completion. Of him truly can the epitaph be writ. He wrote the people lasting good.